Hi everybody, it's Hope Ramsay here in my messy office, and I'm here to read to you the opening chapter of my new novella, Home Sweet Home, which is included in the anthology called Once Upon a Wedding. It's the story about a couple of high school lovers who were star-crossed and whose young love was cut short by the actions of their parents and their chance to get back together many years later. The story opens with my heroine, Isa Alvarez, coming to visit with the father of the boy she used to love. I am likely to make lots of mistakes. I'm not very good at reading out loud, but I thought I would try this just for fun. Chapter 1. Isa Alvarez pushed through Atwood Construction's glass doors, her high heels hammering on the tile floor. Poppy had asked her to come here today, to forgive. She wasn't sure she could fulfill that promise. What she really wanted was to spit in Patrick Atwood's eye. So she dressed to the nines for this meeting in her charcoal gray Lafayette 148 New York spandex dress, the one that showed off her full figure. She'd paired the dress with gently used Christian Louboutin shoes she'd found online. She felt like $1,000,000, which was the point. She needed the expensive clothes like she needed armor. So when Patrick Atwood looked at her, he wouldn't see the same little Latina girl he'd bullied all those years ago. Instead, he'd recognize that she had become powerful and rich in her own right. And if she signed the contract for the Food Network show, she'd almost certainly exceed Mr. Atwood's wealth. And that made her feel good in a very bad way, and not at all in the spirit of forgiveness. She stopped at the receptionist's desk, which was manned by a 20-something woman with a fresh face and blonde hair. "Can I help you?" the young woman asked. "I'm here to see Mr. Atwood," Isa said. "Did you have an appointment?" No. Isa knew better than to ask for an appointment. The old man would have said no. This was, strictly speaking, a forgiveness ambush, one she might happily forgone except for the deathbed promise she'd made to her father, who had died a week ago. Poppy wanted her to find closure on the worst part of her personal history. "Well, I'm sorry, but you really need—" "Just tell him Isabella Alvarez is here to see him," Isa interrupted. The woman blinked a few times. "Oh my God, you're the cocktail lady, aren't you? I saw something on CNBC about your business. I'm a business major at Virginia Tech, and I'm always so impressed when I hear about local women launching successful enterprises. I'm just interning here for the summer." The woman made it sound as if interning at Atwood Construction was a huge disappointment. Isa gave the woman a big smile. "I guess we have that in common because I'm a Hokie too." The woman made the ridiculous gobble sound that all Virginia Tech students learn on day one at that institution. It always struck Isa as idiotic that a university with the reputation of Virginia Tech would choose a turkey as its mascot. "So," Isa said, as one Hokie to another, "can you please let Mr. Atwood know that I'm here and would like to speak with him?" "Well, I guess so, but I'm not supposed to. I know him. I grew up here in Sweet Home. My father was his construction foreman for many years. Unfortunately, Pappy recently passed away." "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss." The young woman picked up the phone and hesitated for a moment before she buzzed the inner office. "Mr. Atwood, Isabella Alvarez is out here. She'd like to have a word with—" The receptionist pulled the handset away from her ear as Mr. Atwood's voice sounded through the small speaker. "I guess he really does know you, huh?" the young woman said as she put the handset back to her ear. Just then, the inner office opened, and Colin Atwood stepped out into the reception area. Colin, not Patrick. Isa's stomach dropped down to her knees, and goosebumps raced over her skin. Was she hot or cold? Damn. Colin hadn't changed much since that day 18 years ago, when they'd run off to Richmond Courthouse together. Oh, he'd aged, of course, but the years had been kind to him. He seemed taller and more masculine than he had before. She lost her breath, and her usually reliable confidence eroded. What would he think about the extra padding around her hips and waist? She might be wearing thousands of dollars in designer clothes, but she suddenly felt fat and frumpy, like an imposter. Isa, he said on a long exhalation, his hazel-eyed stare running up from her shoes to her face and back down, stopping for a long moment on her chest. Well, that hadn't changed, had it? Colin had always loved her breasts, and there were so much more of them to love these days. I was looking for your father. He blinked a moment. He's not here. Oh, well, I'll come back again some. He no longer runs the business, Colin said. He's living at the Shady Brook home these days. Oh, really? Wow. Isa was having a hard time wrapping her brain around the idea that Mr. Atwood had grown old enough to live in one of those assisted living places. Also, the idea of Colin running the family business was equally absurd. Back when they'd been teenagers, Colin had never wanted any part of his father's life. He'd been adamant about that. And besides, he'd been on track to play professional baseball. The last time she'd seen him had been the day the San Francisco Giants had taken him in the first round of the Major League Baseball draft. He'd been nationally touted as a top pitching prospect, but he'd never made it to the majors. What had happened to derail his dreams? She didn't know. She'd walked away and kept her promise to his father. "Why are you here?" he asked. Well, damn. She couldn't exactly tell him that she wanted to forgive his father for what he'd done all those years ago. He had no knowledge of what his father had done to her, and she had every reason to keep that a secret, even though Poppy had died. And besides, she didn't want to reconnect with Colin much. "I wanted to speak with your father," she said, sticking to the truth and not providing any motive. "What? So you could thank him for handing you a bribe all those years ago?" A bribe? Had it been a bribe? Well, maybe from Colin's perspective. Maybe she'd allowed Colin to believe that. But she sure didn't like that word, and she sure didn't like the way the receptionist was watching this conversation like an avid tennis fan, glancing back and forth as each of them spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, and turned her back on him. It was easier to breathe when she didn't have to look at his handsome face. "Yeah, well, I didn't accept your apology back then, and I still don't," he said to her back. She stopped and looked over her shoulder. "I guess I don't blame you," she said in a low voice, which trembled despite her efforts to keep her emotions in check. Funny how she could understand his bitterness now, but had been blind to it all those years ago. Back then, so much had been on the line. Back then, she'd been powerless. But now, things had changed. They'd also stayed the same. There was still someone depending on her secrecy, and Colin still believed the lie that she'd told all those years ago. There was no reason to tell the truth now, water under the bridge and all that, so she strode off out of the office on her expensive shoes and didn't look back. Isabella Alvarez, Isa, was as beautiful as she had ever been, maybe more so now that she was older and rounder. One look at those dark Spanish eyes and that olive-colored skin, and it was like taking a punch to the diaphragm. Colin momentarily lost his ability to breathe, while a sudden acute pain radiated from the center of his chest. But he'd shown nothing. He'd stood his ground. He told her to leave, and she'd gone, her backside swaying as she strutted through the door on those high heels. He didn't know much about women's apparel, but those shoes had red soles, and he remembered Jessica telling him that red-soled shoes could cost $600 or $700 a pair. Who spent that much money on shoes? Isa, apparently. She'd come a long way from the girl he'd once known, and the one who'd been afraid to dream big. But maybe she'd fooled him all those years ago because she'd taken Daddy's bribe and walked away from Colin, and he hated her for it. Her success had been built on the rubble of his shattered heart. He turned his gaze on Madison Thatcher, the summer intern from Tech. She sat wide-eyed at the desk she'd been using while she reviewed the company's profit-loss statements for the last several years. "What are you staring at?" he asked, aware even in the moment that he was channeling his father's anger. He hated that, but it was too late. The words had been spoken, and the young woman jumped in her seat. "Nothing," Madison said, and turned back to the work he'd given her this morning. He turned on his heel and stalked back into the office that had once been his father's domain. A big pile of paperwork sat on the desk. details of his father's business for the last 5 years, years during which Daddy's mind had been slowly deteriorating. Just looking at the mess made Colin feel guilty. If he'd been present at Daddy's life, things would not have slipped so badly. In fact, up until a year ago, Daddy's construction foreman, Isabella's father, Julio, had been effectively running the business. But when Julio got sick and retired, everything fell to crap. Daddy hired out subcontractors who bled him blind and did shoddy work. And no one had clued Colin in because he'd been too deep in his own funk, working his way through Jessica's untimely and unexpected death. Even so, Colin had been across the country, living in California. How much could he have done to stop the slide? Cousin Alice's call 6 months ago had changed all that. A county sheriff's deputy had found Daddy sitting in his car by the side of the road, confused about how to get home. According to passers-by, Daddy had been sitting there for more than half a day, and he'd only been 1.5 miles from home. Colin had come when Alice called, and he discovered his father losing his mind and the once successful Atwood construction tottering on the brink. In an effort to start his life over by going back to the beginning, Colin had decided not to haul Daddy back to San Francisco. Instead, he'd put Daddy in a memory care facility right here in the county, and he'd come home for good. In truth, there hadn't been much holding him in California, just a lot of bittersweet memories of a life that hadn't gone the way he planned. So he'd sold his small construction company and the house Jessica had chosen just 6 months before she'd been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. He'd packed up his SUV with the essentials and sold the rest. He and Liam had driven across the country, stopping at a few landmarks on the way. They'd settled down in Mama and Daddy's house in Sweet Home, Virginia, and now his 8-year-old son was a rising 3rd grader at the same school Colin had gone to as a boy. Come to think of it, Isa had gone to that school too, and she'd been in his 3rd grade class. He stared vacantly at the big pile of invoices he'd been going through this morning. His heart wasn't in the work. His heart wasn't in much these days. Jessica had passed away 3 years ago, and he still loved her and missed her. And missed her. She'd been his confidant, his cheerleader, and the mother of his son. So feeling desire for anyone but Jessica was a betrayal, and yet inside the hard shell of his hurt, a small seed of love still existed for Isa, of his faulty memories. Even after all these years and a successful but short-lived marriage, he'd been unable to pulverize his memories of Isabella Alvarez into oblivion. But he needed to pulverize something, so he turned and put his fist through the sheetrock wall in his father's office. It didn't make him feel any better. In fact, he bruised his knuckles. And that's the end of the first chapter. And I hope you buy our anthology. There are novellas from 11 authors, award-winning and New York and best-selling authors, and my story, Home Sweet Home, is one of them.